And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Steel Curtain Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of SteelCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, the Steel Curtain contributor, Shayne Kubas. We're going to talk about the Steelers' win today, their upcoming schedule gauntlet that's just brutal.
Yeah.
And most importantly, Shayne, we're going to talk about George Pickens, this injury, this hamstring injury that he had, what it means to the team moving forward. We've got injury updates with that. And so we'll get to that in just a little bit as well and talk about that schedule. Let's start, though, with the Steelers versus Browns and rehash this game really quickly. We'll get into it in more detail here in just a second. But the Steelers won 27-14. It's a 2-score win. The offense struggled at times. It wasn't as clean as maybe we would have liked it to have been.
Right.
But even with that, Shayne, the Steelers held a 27-7 lead in the fourth quarter of this game. And so knowing things weren't necessarily going their way, the offense wasn't firing on all cylinders. You didn't have George Pickens. You still found a way to win and win pretty comfortably.
Yeah, and this was more, despite the score not really looking like it, this is more of a classic, like, past 3 years type of Steelers win than it has been more of the wins we've had this year where we've been able to put up points in bunches. And, the score is indicative of kind of a blowout, but especially the early, fourth quarter score. But really, this was about grinding it out and making sure that you sustain drives, that you don't let the Browns get into a rhythm. And luckily, Jameis Winston had more of his negative games opposed to one of his more positive games. Outside of that touchdown drive early in the game, they really didn't get anything going until late. So, yeah, they definitely grinded it out, but the offense was certainly not the offense we've seen in recent weeks.
Yeah, and along with that, Shayne, leading up to the game, we didn't read too much into the Pickens injury. We saw the hamstring pop up on Friday's practice report, but reportedly he had suffered this injury on Thursday, wasn't able to really do much during Friday's practice. They ruled him out of the game, which was a surprise to us. Mm-hmm. And now the injury is worse than we anticipated. It's a grade 2 hamstring strain. And so sometimes this can linger as long as 4 to 6 weeks. It depends on the severity. But we've seen examples of this already. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show and what kind of time Pickens could be looking at missing. And most importantly, what impact does it have on the Steelers? Can they survive this gauntlet without him? And I think that's going to be a real challenge for Pittsburgh. So we'll get back to that in just a few minutes here. Stay with us. If you're joining us in the live chat and you have any questions, please drop them in here for us. Shayne and I would love to be able to get to those for you. NFL Power Rankings, Shayne. I checked them out this morning. My Power Rankings roundup article is just about finished here. The Steelers, surprisingly, according to a couple media outlets, dropped in the Power Rankings this week, despite back-to-back wins against AFC North opponents. ESPN has them dropping one spot. So does USA Today. Nate Davis. This is not overly surprising considering the circumstances. It's because Minnesota had a pretty convincing 42-21 win this past week, kind of leapfrog them in the rankings. Either way, Shayne, they're sitting right around the 6th spot if you average out their positioning, and really everything either has them from the 5th spot down to the 7th spot. So they're somewhere in that mix. Do you think that that's fair to put on them right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where I view them in the grand scope of the league, because realistically, we know that this team's highs are good enough to be even higher than that, like when the offense is running on all cylinders and the defense is playing complementary football. But this defense has had a couple lapses this season. The offense, clearly, especially if Pickens is missing any amount of time, is not as potent as some of the other top offenses that rank ahead of them. So there is reason to doubt them being any higher than that, but I think any lower than that would be kind of disingenuous as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's fair, and we'll see what happens this week. But we could be looking at very different positioning in the power rankings over these next couple of weeks. The Steelers have a really hard stretch here, and for good or for bad, we'll see which way that ends up going. Let's talk about the playoff picture, updated playoff picture now. For the longest time, it was weeks in a row, the Steelers would have been hosting the Baltimore Ravens had the playoffs ended at that point in time. Now, as we enter week 15, if the season were to end today, there's been a change in that. The Baltimore's moved up a spot. The Broncos have moved down. So the Steelers would be hosting the Denver Broncos in the wild card round of the playoffs. Shayne, do you feel better about that matchup than to bring Lamar Jackson and company to Pittsburgh?
I don't know, honestly. That's because ideally, like, if this was any other team that the Ravens are playing, that I'd probably say I'd obviously rather not play the Ravens. But with the Steelers, you don't know, right? Because granted, if they beat them again this regular season, which we'll talk about at some point soon, beating them 3 times might be asking too much, even for the way this matchup has gone recently. But realistically, like, in the grand scheme of things, I'd rather play the Broncos because it's a rookie quarterback. It's a defense that is very, very good, but has had some lapses. They didn't play particularly great against us, especially considering we weren't playing Russell Wilson yet. Like, realistically, that matchup is better in a lot of ways. But at the same time, with the past history with the Ravens, I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get what you're saying there too. And on paper, it's like, do I want to play against Lamar Jackson?
Of course I want to play
a rookie quarterback in Bo Nix. But the thing is, this Broncos team has just gotten progressively better. And what's shocking, Shayne, they actually lead their entire division, the Chiefs and the Chargers, in point differential this year with 71. And so they've blown teams out at times. They've got a stout defense. Like, it wouldn't be a walk in the park, that's for sure. I mean, you're talking playoffs, so no game is really. But I don't know how I would feel about this. But like you said, can you beat the Ravens 3 times in a year? I don't know. We still have to see how the second one goes. But that would be concerning as well. So keep an eye on that. We'll watch how things unfold. We have reached the part of the season where we're talking about teams being eliminated. We're talking about teams clinching, and we're closely tracking who Pittsburgh could potentially be playing in the playoffs. And we could see a monumental shift, Shayne. Maybe they don't hold on to first place in the AFC North. Maybe they have to play as a road wild card team, but their playoff spot should be secure at this point. I mean, one more win does it. That's all it's going to take. And the wild card teams are pretty much wrapped up. Like, when you look at this playoff picture right now, it's like, all right, you've got the Ravens, Broncos, and Chargers as the 3 wild card seeds right now. The next team is the 6 and 7 Colts, 6 and 7 Dolphins right there in the mix. 5 and 8 Bengals are essentially out of it at this point. You pretty much need to win out. So I don't think those other teams are even threatening, really, barring like a flawless stretch. They need to be perfect in these last 5 games to come back and potentially steal a wild card spot. But I think the playoff teams in the AFC have already been determined.
I think most likely. I think the Dolphins and the Colts have an outside shot. I think the Bengals, like you said, they need so much to go their way, and they need to win out, which people would tell you that with Joe Burrow, you can do that. And I'd say, well, they're 5 and 8 with him right now. So there's no guarantee that that'll happen. I mean, when you have a defense that is as poor as the Bengals defense is, there's just no guarantee. Any amount of points can guarantee you a win, right? Like, this is what it comes down to. So I think the Dolphins are the most interesting team there. However, I wouldn't care if they make the playoffs because, frankly, I don't think they can go on the road and win a playoff game. I don't think they're built to do that. I don't care how
cold weather.
I do not care how well Tua plays or doesn't play. That the rest of that team just isn't good enough this year, in my opinion. So, but realistically, we probably know the 7 AFC playoff teams, and if not, maybe one of them drops out.
Yeah, I think so as well. And the Bengals, such an interesting team this year because
crazy.
Joe Burrow is playing so well. Like, this might be his best season.
It is.
The defense is so bad. The defense is so bad that they just don't have a shot at doing anything this year. And so you see, you don't often see like a bona fide MVP caliber season paired with a team that has a 5 and 8 record, barely got past the Dallas Cowboys, took a bunch of fluky plays in the fourth quarter to win that game. And so, not great from their perspective this year. And
it's very
if you're a Bengals fan, I mean, you got to be disappointed. You finally get this franchise quarterback. It seems like, all right, you should be like this perennial team that's in the playoffs, and it's just not happening for them. Injuries, crappy defense, whatever it is, it's just not working out well for them. All right, Shayne, let's move on and talk about Steelers versus Browns notes this week. And again, if you guys are here in the chat and you have any questions for us, please drop them in here. Let's start with the offensive side of the ball and quarterback Russell Wilson. Not a great game on paper, at least. Now, him and the offense at least capped off 3 scoring drives with touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns by Wilson. And so he kind of salvaged his stats a little bit in this game. But when you're only completing, 12?
It's 15 of
26 for 158 yards, very lackluster production. Scotty Miller was your top wide receiver in this game. Freiermuth had 10 more yards than him. 48 yards was your top overall pass catching option in this game. No George Pickens. We saw how that affected the Steelers. It wasn't great. Like, this is the thing, is when you're playing a team like the Browns, I know it's a rivalry game. It's an AFC North battle, but you would like to have more success through the air than what the Steelers witnessed. Thankfully, their defense created 3 turnovers, and James Pierre and Keanu Benton got interceptions of all people, just like we all thought it would happen.
Right.
So
yeah, why not?
But I think that we would like to see better production, obviously, from Russell Wilson in the offense in general in a game where this is, I mean, you're talking about a 3-10 now football team.
Yeah, and I think especially if just focusing on Russell Wilson for a second, he didn't play poorly, I don't think. I don't think this is a question of, like, did he play bad or not? It's about clearly this offense, when you remove George Pickens from it, you lose about obviously 70 to 80 yards of offense through the air because you're probably not replicating that elsewhere, right? You're probably not you're not just like, oh, I'm going to try to get that other ways. You're just not getting it probably. Mm-hmm. Like, it just disappears from the offense probably, in my opinion. And, obviously you hit a couple plays. The throw to Pat Freiermuth for a touchdown was fantastic. You get the little kind of trickery going on in the red zone. The touchdown to Van Jefferson was nice. But you're manufacturing offense without Pickens, opposed to the calculated deep shots to him or the throws to him over the middle of the field where you can try to break a tackle and run up the sideline. Like, you're just losing that. You don't have anyone that can replicate that production. So you have to figure other stuff out. I think they did enough in this game. Against the Eagles, though, and we're going to talk about that game, shortly, I don't know that you can really manufacture enough offense without him to have a productive passing game.
Yeah, there's no question in my mind that if the Steelers would replicate this same passing offense, it's going to result in a loss against the Eagles. Like, you have to find a way to be improved from what you were without Pickens. Can you turn around and do it in 1 week's time when you kind of haven't had answers at the receiver position anyway? I think that's what's kind of concerning, though, is when you look at the receivers in this game, it's like, oh yeah, we expect Mike Williams to step up in this absence. Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, like Scotty Miller's your top receiver in this game. And there were some issues there. Now, I think that Williams was efficient going to him still. And so three or four targets, 36 yards in this game, but he's just not getting open at a high enough clip to be a guy that you can go to with the football. And so I think that's part of the issue there as well. We look at the running backs in this game, Shayne. Jaylen Warren is back. I think he's finally healthy, dealt with hamstring and knee injuries since the preseason. And you can just see how it affected his play early on in the year. But these last like 4-ish weeks for Jaylen Warren, you can tell he's got that explosion back. This is a guy, and I just wrote an article about this. You can check it out on stillcurtain.com. This is the player they have to rely on against the Eagles this week for their spark. You're not going to get that spark without Pickens. Calvin Austin can give you the spark every once in a blue moon, but he's small. He's not as consistent. And so I think that that's who you're going to have to rely on. He had a really solid game against the Browns.
Yeah, I think Warren especially, like, now that he looks more like himself, I want to see him get more involved in the offense. And specifically, I want to point this out. And, we're talking about Warren here, not Najee, but can we please stop the toss sweeps with Najee Harris, at least most of the time? Like, it's killing his, like, if people want to talk about his yards per carry in this game, it's like, yeah, you take out the 2nd and 10 runs that never work, that consistently get put in the playbook, and the toss sweeps, he's probably averaging like 8 yards a carry, because that he just doesn't, it's not going to work with those plays typically. Sometimes it works, but in the middle of the field, like, they're just going to be able to run that down and not prevent him from getting outside. Like, throw that to Jaylen Warren. If you want to do toss sweep, let Jaylen Warren do. At least he might be able to actually, like, make somebody miss quickly and get up the field faster. But yeah, if Warren's healthy like he's been, he definitely needs to continue to be a big part of the offense, and particularly in the passing game, probably like that. And he's not going to replicate Pickens' production. Obviously, he doesn't play receiver, but you need somebody who can create yards after the catch, and he's pretty much all they got right now that's consistent.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you look at this group again, so we'll move on to the skill players in general. It's just like Austin and Jefferson combined for 14 yards on 5 targets. Like, it's not worth passing them the football if that's what it's going to be. Darnell Washington, I would have thought maybe would have seen an uptick with Pickens being out. I know he's not going to be a high volume guy ever, but had 1 target in this game, 0 catches. Like, now is the time. If there's ever a time to get your tight ends involved, Shayne, it's during this stretch where you could be without your top playmaker. And so we've seen Washington go down the seam. We've seen Freiermuth do it. I wish that the Steelers could find a way to do it without having to even engineer these targets. Just throw to these guys because they can make stuff happen. And so it is interesting to just kind of look at the scope of things and predict like who is going to step up to the plate, because somebody's going to have to at this point.
Yeah, and like if you look at the receiving group, like you said, the Austin and Jefferson had the touchdown, which is great, but short throw in the end zone, nothing special there. He wasn't covered by anybody because of the play action element there. Austin didn't do anything, which is disappointing, but again, that happens with him sometimes, depending on the game plan and who they're playing. Scotty Miller leading your team in receiving in 2024 is not ideal, at least in the receiver position. Obviously, Freiermuth leads the team with 48 yards. It comes down to the tight ends, like you said. They have to, and we'll get into talking about the specifics of the Eagles game later on in the show, but it has to come from them. It's not coming from the receiving group. It just isn't. Like you can sit there and try to say, oh, well, if you get a couple more plays, Mike Williams or this or that, it's like, I'm not relying on that. Like I cannot guarantee that they're going to be able to do that. What I can guarantee from what I've seen from these tight ends is they can be a bigger part of the passing game if you need them to be. They already probably should be, but if we haven't needed them to be for the most part, right? Like it hasn't been a necessity. Now it is. You have to figure out a way to get specifically Freiermuth, because he's obviously easier to get the ball to. But even Washington, like design plays for him, figure out a way to get him on the run moving so he can truck the defensive backs for the Eagles. Like whatever you have to do, but that has to be what you do.
Yeah, I agree. A look at the offensive line here. There was no egregious performances in this game. As expected, Dan Moore had a couple of sloppy reps against Myles Garrett.
Which will happen.
That's going to happen. He's had far worse games against him. Garrett ended up getting his sack there in the second half, I believe. And so nothing awful, though, from this game. And you go and look at grades. I didn't really think the grades super lined up with what I saw on the film this time around. Like somehow Mason McCormick gets a dismal game, like grade every other game. And I think that McCormick always does a pretty solid job, but
yeah,
as an offensive lineman, you're only as good as your 3 or 4 worst reps. And so
that's the problem. I think he will have a rep or two every week, typically, where it's like, all right, but, and that takes the grade if you're looking at it from a grading perspective for people who look at those, but it doesn't change the fact that he had a good game overall. It just changes, the overall performance grade. So
yeah, no concerns there really from me on the offensive line. I think that they've played better games, obviously, than they did against Cleveland.
Yeah.
But the only concern with the offensive line is the depth at this point, obviously. When you've got James Daniels and Nate Herbig and Troy Fautanu out for the season, you just can't afford the injuries at this point. And fortunately, they've been pretty healthy since all those early season injuries. Herbig's happened even before the season started. So if they can keep a healthy offensive line, they should be smooth sailing going into the playoffs. Let's shift over to the defensive side of the ball, Shayne, and talk about this defensive line. Like it's the highlight of the Steelers almost every game. And it's not just because of TJ Watt. It's because of Cam Hayward. This week, it's because of Alex Highsmith, who's only played about half the season so far with his injuries. Herbig was less of a factor this game for sure than what he's been in the past, but Keanu Benton come up with the play of the game and the interception where you just that looked like a Madden play right there. It's like you accidentally switch on to a defensive lineman. You're like, oh, I recognize this is a screen pass. And you cut right in front of it and take it back the other way. But whoever it is, the Steelers seem to come up with just big plays one game after the next. It's just what they do. We've got a long enough sample of it at this point to know that it's not a fluke. It's how they're coached. It's how they're engineered. Those big plays happen. This week it was Benton.
Yeah, and the thing with this defensive line and ultimately for this team, it's been this way for a long time. We talk about it a lot. The defense goes as the defensive line goes. When they have a typical performance, they have a typical day on defense, which is a top 10 unit, right? When they have an incredible day, they have a top 5 unit. And when they're okay, the defense plummets to not even okay usually, honestly. Let's be honest about it. Like, they go as far as this defensive line goes. And luckily for them, it's about as good as it gets in the NFL, right? Especially with Cam Hayward playing the way he has right now. I mean, I've mentioned it before. I know how great TJ is. I know he's having a season for his standards is actually kind of below his standards in a lot of way, in my opinion. He's still leading for Defensive Player of the Year. I think probably Cam should be leading for Defensive Player of the Year. For him to be doing this at the defensive line, like interior defensive line position, at his age, and with the run defense included in, you just don't see it from anyone. You just don't. Like, this is a abnormal season in every way possible. Even if he could be 25 years old, this would be an abnormal season for an interior defensive lineman to have. He's 35. Like, at some point, you have to look and go, okay, like we get it. TJ is the best player in the defense. give Cam his flowers. Like the defensive player of the year odds needs to kind of like shift a little bit in my opinion. At least get Cam up there somewhere in there. Like maybe not, if you're not going to have him lead it, whatever, he needs to be up there.
Oh, there's absolutely a case to be made for Cam, and it's mind-boggling that he's not higher. And I think that it's largely because TJ Watt is that front runner for the award this year. If they weren't on the same team, then maybe Cam's up there higher. But there's absolutely an argument to be made for him. I think I heard somebody say he might become the first interior defender age 35 or older to record a 10-sack season. He's nearly there, and so probably going to get it by the end of the year. Just been a dominant performance all around by him, but you can't say enough good things about the defensive line. And really, I think a storyline that not a lot of people noticed is the Steelers only played with 3 healthy interior defenders this game. Larry Ogunjobi got banged up, and so you literally just had Cam Hayward, Keanu Benton, and Isaiah Loudermilk. Those were your 3 guys. Dean Lowry was a scratch from the game beforehand, and Montravius Adams wasn't ready to come back yet. Like, this line is really thin. They're good, but the interior line right now at this point in time is thin, and it's remarkable that these guys were able to hold up, play as many snaps as they were able to play, and still do a respectable job in this game, knowing how fatigued they must have been. And so hopefully the unit can get back to full strength here soon. Hayward needs a break. Like, there's no way that guy should be playing the number of snaps that he's playing at this stage in his career. He's just defying father time like crazy.
Yeah, they have done a better job of limiting him closer to like 70% of the snaps this year prior to a game like this. But yeah, if they want to keep him healthy and active down the stretch of the season, they definitely need to make sure they can sub him out a little bit more. So
for sure, and that has to be the goal. This is what we've talked about, Shayne, the last couple of years, is that your best players can't be overworked in the regular season. You have to be able to perform and go all out in the playoffs. And so obviously TJ Watt wasn't healthy for the Bills game last year, but the Steelers have overworked him as well. Yeah. And you talk about his snap count. He is second among all edge defenders in snap counts, only behind Myles Garrett. And I cut up an interesting stat this morning, Shayne, of 18 players that have played over 610 defensive snaps this year in the NFL. There's only 5 of them, I believe, that have a grade over 86. TJ Watt has a grade of 92.4 right now in the season, according to Pro Football Focus. Of players who have played 700 snaps, that list goes down to just 4 players, and Watt is the only one of them with a grade above 75. And so there's a direct correlation between how overworked and fatigued you are and your grade, because obviously the more snaps you're being asked to play, you're not going to be able to go all out on a play-by-play basis. It affects your pass rush win rate. It affects your play-to-play effectiveness when you're not able and not afforded to take a break. And so you can understand why Watt's numbers are down in some of these areas, like the win rate, like the pressure rate. He doesn't get to take breaks. The guy plays a lot of snaps. And if you're comparing it to a player like Max Crosby, who was in the DPOY running last year, I mean, Crosby's grade and statistical production doesn't hold a candle to what Watt's doing right now in a similar snap count. And so you can see how impressive it is for Watt to be as effective as he is still, knowing how many snaps he has to play. And kind of he's legitimately in a tier of his own in terms of the players who play as many snaps as he does.
Yeah, and I think another thing too that can't be discredited for his season, as much as the pass rushing overall hasn't been as productive, especially on a per play basis that people talk about. And this is something, again, this is how much do you value this, and I think for a Steelers team, you value it a lot because it's important to them. But among players who have had at least 200 reps in run defense at the edge position, he's the only player with a 90-plus grade, and only one of 2 players with even an 80 grade, with Harold Landry of the Tennessee Titans, actually, that has had a run defense grade of anywhere close to 90 this season with that many snaps. Like, his run defense is game-changing for this defense. It just is. You see the amount of plays he makes. You can force fumbles in those situations. You can create tackles for loss. Like, people have to avoid him in the run game, and that's something that edge rushers usually, you're not known for doing that, obviously, right? So he's a weapon on both sides of that in terms of run and pass. So you got to give him his flowers, but at the same time, you're right that for him playing this much, you always start to wonder down the stretch of the season, like, is he gonna, because there's even, I think, a point in this game where he kind of limped off for a second, or looked a little bit kind of lame. And I was like, do not tell me, that this is where this happens. At least Herbig and Highsmith were available this game if that would have happened. But, they have to have all three of those guys healthy, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, for sure. And Shayne, what I found so comical is it happened a couple of times in this game. Why are teams still letting TJ Watt come backside pursue in run defense like that? Like, he's going to make the play, and you're fortunate if you don't get the ball raked out of your hands when you leave him unblocked like that. And so typically he is. Every once in a while, though, teams will be like, all right, we'll just run away from Watt. Well, you got to still put a body on him, or he's going to track you down
leave
that way as well.
Standing there,
yeah.
I don't know. It's funny.
It is. And I've heard a counter argument too, where it's like, well, Watt only has a good run defense grade because he's punching the ball out. I'm like, when is punching the ball out not important? I'm like, he's literally saved a touchdown. You go back to the Raiders game.
Yeah,
he saved a touchdown by punching the ball out. Did it twice in that game. Watt, again, leads the NFL in forced fumbles. He leads the NFL in forced fumbles since he came into the league in 2017. Like, he is good at what he does, and teams have trouble running on his side. And so I feel like definitely a value trait, an underrated trait. There's so much today is all the talk about pass rush win rate, how fast you get to the quarterback. Those things are really important. What Watt does also is really important. And again, you talk about a player doing it at age 30, being fatigued, still being as well-rounded a player as he is. He's just a remarkable football player still, and he deserves to be in that conversation. Now there's another conversation to be had, that should Watt be the runaway favorite for Defensive Player of the Year? And I do think the odds are a little bit head scratching, knowing that the most recent updated odds from DraftKings Sportsbook was Watt was minus 220 odds. The next highest was Pat Surtain at plus 900. So a huge gap between the two. So I do think the gap in odds should be bridged, but Watt absolutely should be a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. This is a 10-3 football team. They've got a top defense. Watt is still playing at a high level. He still has the statistical production. He leads the NFL in tackles for loss. He has 3 sacks behind the lead. And so he leads the league in forced fumbles. He's still right in that conversation of what you want. Just obviously the biggest knock on him this season is the pressure and the pressure rate, just not what we've been used to seeing from him in his younger days. All right. Any questions you want to get? Oh, we're going to go to special teams real quick. The guy I want to highlight, Shayne, Ben Skoranek. Can't say enough good things about this guy since he came to Pittsburgh. Had another fumble recovery off a play. He's always the first guy down there as the gunner. Kadarius Toney coughed up the football. Skoranek was all over it. Browns cut Toney right after the game. So Toney also had the boneheaded penalty in this one too. So Toney has like 2 plays out there and gets a 15-yarder and loses a fumble for Cleveland. So not a good day for him. But Skoranek just makes play after play for special teams.
Yeah, I mean, he's been really good. It's been nice to have somebody like that as a gunner on this team, especially with Miles Boykin no longer on the team. He was kind of that main guy, so it helps to have someone replace him. Real quick on the defense, I did want to mention that I thought the linebacker play this past week was very good in general, which I know has been kind of an up and down thing for this team, especially Patrick Queen. But I thought that they all played rather well. For the most part, I think that especially in coverage, they managed themselves pretty good. Like a lot of the bigger plays were more down the field. They didn't allow a lot of stuff in the middle of the field, which I thought really helps the defense, especially. So,
yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. I kind of breezed right over that. But the linebacker play, maybe collectively from your top 3 off-ball linebackers, was one of the best performances we've seen.
Yeah, they all played their role really well.
I mean, yes, Roberts is still that missile launcher. I thought that Queen had a really good bounce back game after struggling. And that's kind of been the story of Queen's career, especially with the Steelers already, is that roller coaster. You ride those waves with him where he looks really bad at times. I mean, he's literally given up 10 catches on 10 targets for 160 yards in a game. And then he turns around and it's like, he's all over the place, just making plays everywhere. And so you'd like to see that one come alive more often. Peyton Wilson, same thing. Not being asked to play that full-time role yet, but he's going to get there. This guy has everything that you want. And I cut up some of his plays from that game, the sideline speed and just football awareness from him to close and make plays is impressive. And right now, for what it's worth, Elandon Roberts is grading out as the 5th best off-ball linebacker in the league. Peyton Wilson is 10th already as a rookie linebacker. And so a far cry from what we saw these past few years with the Steelers, and really since the career-ending injury to Shazier. It's been rough patchwork job at linebacker, and we haven't found any options until just recently. And this collection of three the Steelers have right now is probably the strongest group of three that we've seen in a really long time.
Yeah, I agree. So that's definitely been a plus for them recently, especially. So.
All right. Not a lot to mention from the secondary. Joey Porter, I thought, had a bounce back game compared to the fiasco, the six penalty game the week prior against the Bengals. It was an okay game. Jameis Winston didn't do much damage through the air. It was held to just 212 yards on 41 attempts. It was only 5.2 yards per attempt. And some of that even came in the fourth quarter when the game was essentially out of reach. And they go and put together like a 14-play, 79-yard touchdown drive or something in the fourth. So kind of didn't matter as much at that point, but pretty good game overall from the defense. But again, like we said, highlight is the defensive line in this game. It continues to be, and there's always somebody that's making big plays for them. Highsmith came up big too. We got to mention Highsmith, give him his flowers for this game. Great performance back. Good to have him healthy here and making plays for the Steelers. Anybody else from the special teams, Shayne, before we move on to our next topic here?
I mean, it wasn't necessarily him doing it, but Waven did have a really nice punt that Tony had to obviously fumbled trying to go backwards and get. So you got to give him a little bit of credit. He was definitely pumped up for that one. And special teams just continue to be a huge bonus for this team. And as long as that's the case, it always is nice to have.
Yeah, and like we said, we're going to have a Waitman conversation because after this year, because Cam Johnson went down with that season-ending injury very early in the year, but Corliss Waitman has been fantastic for the Steelers, as good as you can ask a backup punter to be, and then some. All right, if you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and would like to support the Steel Curtain Podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right, Shayne, let's talk about George Pickens and the injury impact he's going to have on the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is big. I know the Steelers were able to come away unscathed from the Browns game in a 2-score win, but that's a 3-10 football team. You're talking about a whole different type of animal here coming up in this late season gauntlet, starting off with the Eagles. And for what it's worth, the Steelers have not won a game in Philadelphia since 1965. They've lost 10 straight games on the road over there. Mike Tomlin's lost 3 straight games on the road against the Eagles. Their last matchup on the road against the Eagles resulted in a 35-13 loss. You need all hands on deck for this game. Shayne, when the schedule came out back in May, I made my game-by-game predictions. And if there was one game that I circled on the calendar as a loss, it was this one. The Steelers just don't play well against this team in general, home or away. And then when you factor in the setting and the circumstances and predicting that the Eagles were going to be a good team, well, the Eagles ended up being a great team again. I mean, they had that one down year last year where it's like, all right, are they pretender? Back on top again, high point differential, 11-2 record. They don't have the roster holes around their team that they did last year. Now you're going to get some Eagles fans that'll definitely complain about how some of the things have gone recently. They just narrowly got past the Panthers and they're not passing as well as they want to be, but they're still winning football games. This team has won 9 straight games. And now the Steelers have to go on their turf in a situation where they're not good anyway and do it without your best receiver. I think Pickens' impact and the loss is going to be huge.
Yeah, and there's actually, we just had a chat here. I'll throw it up here because it's kind of part of that. What percentage would you give that Pickens plays this week, and what's the key for the offense to produce this game? Percentage, probably less than 10%. I don't think they chance it against a team that they're probably already not super confident. They're not going to say this, obviously, but a game that you might not win with George Pickens anyway. I think that they're probably willing to give him more time. And then the key for the offense to produce, and we can talk about, like who will step up in his absence. Realistically, you have to go through the tight ends, I think. I mentioned it earlier. I think that if you want to replicate and or get some more production in the passing game, it's probably coming from that group, because realistically, what more can you ask the wide receivers to do? Like we saw what happened this past game. Scotty Miller was your leading receiver. It's probably just not coming. Like Mike Williams, you might be able to get a couple plays out of him, maybe, right? You might be able to get a Calvin Austin play or two, because he's been known to do that this season every couple games. But realistically, if you want to get a volume passing game going, it's going to be involving the tight ends and obviously the backs more probably too, specifically Warren.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are the players who are going to have to step up without him. And going back to what percent chance, I would put it as a 5% chance, maybe less. It's just when a head coach comes out on a Tuesday press conference and says, my player is doubtful already before you even have a chance to log your first practice of the week. Like, he's not going to play in this game. And judging by the severity of the injury, this could linger on. Now, I've heard different things, and there's been different evaluations of this injury. Some say that this is a 1 to 2 week injury. Others, and examples that we've seen, who have suffered grade 2 hamstring pulls, this has been as much as a 4 or 5 week injury. And if you look up some data on it, sometimes they'll say it's a 4 to 6 week injury. I don't think that Pickens is going to be out that long. He doesn't have a history of the soft tissue injuries. Did have a knee injury in college, but unrelated to this, obviously. Yeah. He's a young guy. I think he's going to bounce back sooner than that. But putting that timetable on it is hard because the Steelers, Shayne, have 3 games in an 11-day stretch. 3 games. What an NFL scheduling fiasco that was on their part. And I can't help but think that it has something to do with Hard Knocks. You want to slide all these games in here at once, late in the season, and then capping off with Christmas Day against the Chiefs. But that is really hard. We're going to talk about that schedule here in just a second. But Pickens' injury is a grade 2 hamstring pull. I think it's going to keep him out. My prediction is 2 more weeks. And again, I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm not a doctor, but just from everything that I've seen collectively from this injury, knowing that the Steelers turn around and play on Saturday after this game, which is, again, you're talking about a 1-day difference between Saturday and Sunday, but that's just one less day to recover from a hamstring injury. Can you really rush him back? And Shayne, the question needs to be, why rush him back? You've got a greater than a 99% chance to make the playoffs at this point, the Steelers do, in terms of their probability. It's more important for Pickens to be healthy in the playoffs, even if it meant that you were playing from a wild card seed on the road, rather than getting by, earning a home field advantage in the playoffs and not having your best player available or your best offensive weapon available for you in that game.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with it is realistically you'd like to have him back next week because you want to win one of these next 3 games, and I don't think they can without him. I really don't think they're capable of beating any of these teams without him. I know the Ravens are weird and we beat them for weird reasons, but we normally have Pickens, we've been doing that recently, so he matters a lot. You think of the game-winning touchdown last year, like he's a big part of that. So if he doesn't play in that game, that throws that out the window, in my opinion. Then you have the Chiefs, obviously, where it's like the Chiefs aren't as good as their record is, but they're also the Chiefs, so therefore they're still dangerous. Like, that's going to be an absolute just, like, devil magic game if there's ever been one. Like, holy crap. Like, who knows I have no idea how that game's going to go because I have zero idea. But in general, like, without Pickens, I don't know if you can really confidently say they have a chance in any of these games that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, it's going to be rough. But you said it, Shayne. Jaylen Warren's got to step up. Najee Harris has to step up. It's hard to trust any one of these receivers because their lows have been really low. I mean, so low that you don't notice that they're playing football. Like that was like Van Jefferson early in the season. We had to question, why is he even out there? Like, he had no impact on the team. Now he's made some big plays. He's landed a few touchdown grabs. But this is not a good unit collectively without Pickens here. And so you're going to have to rely on the part of your offense that is good, like your running game, and your running game can be really good at times, and your tight ends. And your tight ends, I think, could be one of the top units if they were utilized a little bit more in the passing offense, and they just really aren't. Like, they're just not that big of a part of that game. But I think the collection, I don't think that Freiermuth is an elite tight end. He's not in the same category as the guys at the top of the league. He's a tier down from that. But I think between Freiermuth and Washington, you should be able to make those guys work. You should be able to find Washington down the seam. You should be able to get Freiermuth the ball. Like, this is the type of game, Shayne, if you're ever be like, I'm going to pepper Freiermuth with 8 to 10 targets, do it now, because I'd rather Pat get the ball down the middle of the field rather than trying to force some of those targets to Van Jefferson or to Mike Williams in the sideline, whatever it is. I'd love for Williams to step up. I'm just not a big believer at this point that he's got hardly any gas left in the tank to make things happen other than the contested sideline balls. And that's kind of all we've seen so far. It's what he's given us. We go back to evaluating that trade, and we said, yes, the Williams trade paid for itself already when he caught the over-the-shoulder fourth quarter touchdown game winner against the Washington Commanders on the road. That was worth the price of admission, the cost of the 2025 fifth-round pick right there. But since then, we've got nothing out of him. And I actually broke down his stats in an article this morning. In his 5 games with the Steelers, Mike Williams is averaging 0.8 receptions per game and 12 yards a game. So it's not good. I mean, it's minimal impact. And on a positive note, Russell Wilson has a perfect passer rating thrown to him, but it's on 5 target samples, so it's pretty small. And I think the reason why the target sample is so small is he's just not getting open very often.
No, that's the thing ultimately. And you talked about, like, if there's ever a week to just throw 10 targets at Freiermuth, realistically, the Eagles defense is much better in the middle than it's been. I do like the linebackers they have there right now. They've had Zach Bond have a breakout season from, former, Wisconsin guy actually as well. So, shout out Wisconsin again. But hybrid linebacker, edge type of guy is settled in as linebacker now. Nakobe Dean's been pretty good out of Georgia now in his 3rd year, I think it is now. So, they are good in the middle, but they're much more dangerous on the perimeter with Quinyon Mitchell playing at a high level as a rookie. Darius Slay's still out there. They have guys like Cooper DeJean in the slot. They can play safety as well. It's much scarier to attack this team on the edges than I think it is in the middle. So that's where they should be going with the football as much as they can.
Yeah, I agree, Shayne. Let's go back to the scope of Pickens' injury one more time, Shayne. And I want to ask you your multiple choice question here for the day.
All right.
Does Pickens miss 0 games, 1, 2, 3 or more games?
I think he misses 1. I think he misses this game coming up. I think he misses 1 more. I think he misses this week. And I think that they do have him play against the Ravens. Maybe it's not on a full-time basis. Maybe they want to give him the chance to go out and prove that he's good to go, that he doesn't need to take more time. So you could see him with a reduced snap share, or you could see him in certain packages or whatever. But I think that they know that unless he's truly not good enough to go, that they need him out there, right? I really think if they thought he had a chance to go this week, that he'd be out there this week too, because of the gravity of these games, right? These are very important games down the stretch for seeding, for having a chance to win the division. All that stuff matters. So if he can go, I think he will, and I think that it'll be as soon as next week.
Shayne, my prediction, if the Steelers were not playing the Ravens next week, I think that Pickens would miss 2 games.
Okay.
But knowing that if you lose to the Ravens, that is a 2-game swing.
Yes.
And potentially the division title right there.
Yes. I
think they're going to do everything in their power to get him back for the Ravens on Saturday next week. And I don't want to see an injury setback. We know how sensitive these soft tissue injuries are. Hamstring specifically, you are so susceptible to doing that if you play and you're not yet fully recovered. I hope that he is by that time, and maybe he will be. But I wish that they didn't have such an important game in week 16 in that slot, because I think the Steelers probably would be okay with maybe resting him 1 more week. I think that they're going to really try to give it a go. And I think that he plays next Saturday against the Ravens. That would be my guess. So these are just our predictions. We don't know how things are going to unfold from here. Again, there's still a slight chance that he plays this week, according to all the reports. That looks very, very discouraging, though, considering that Tomlin already considered him doubtful this week. Let's talk about that daunting schedule here for a second, Shayne. The Steelers got the Eagles this Sunday in week 15. Week 16, they get the Ravens on Saturday, and then you turn around from Saturday to Wednesday, and you have to host the Kansas City Chiefs. Boy, did the NFL ever screw the Steelers over on this stretch right here, Shayne. You talk about three games, 11-day stretch, and your 3 good opponents, and you're capping it off with the Super Bowl defending Kansas City Chiefs when they don't have to play on as short as a week as what Pittsburgh does. This is going to be rough. And so I don't know how you get past this. If I were to give it a record prediction right now, I would hesitate to even do that, because I don't feel confident starting off with the first game and then knowing that after you play this Eagles game, you're going to be on short week and then real short week after that against 2 really good teams. I think this might be an 0-3 stretch. I think it might be 0-3. Yeah. And I don't want to be that pessimist. It's just, this is a perfect storm against the Steelers, much like their road game against Cleveland was after Thursday Night Football.
Yeah, and I think if you're a Steelers fan, I think you should be hoping for 1-2. Like I think that's being hopeful. And I hate to say that, like you said, because I don't want to discredit what this team has done up to this point in the season. I don't want to discredit what Russell Wilson has brought to the team. I don't want to discredit the coaching. But this is just a tough stretch. I don't really care who you give the schedule to in the NFL. It's not good. It sucks. Let's just be honest about it. Like, this is not a stretch that you want to be facing as a team that's trying to lock up a division title, that's trying to get momentum going into the playoffs. Like, this is just brutal. And I think how you start this is, realistically, you have to put up a really good fight against the Eagles. I really have a hard time believing, and we'll talk about this game here a little bit. I have a hard time believing without George Pickens that they can do that. But I think putting up a good fight against the Eagles on the road is going to be really important. Then you have to go to the Ravens, and you have to try to beat them for what would be, I think, the 9th out of last 10 times, which is just really hard to do in this league against anybody. Most people would probably say that they should be expected to win that game because of the recent history. It just, you never know. And, then you have to host the Chiefs on Christmas Day, which, maybe it's better than facing any Chiefs regular season team in the past 5 years, but it's still the Chiefs, and if they've lost one game and it's to the Bills, it's just a tough stretch.
Yeah, these three teams, Shayne, have a combined record of 31-8 entering week 15 here.
Yeah.
And to have them all back to back, not only are these 3 consecutive games, 2 of them are on the road and 3 of them in an 11-day stretch, is as tight of a stretch as you can possibly cram in the NFL. And so it's just not a good situation. It's why we said so often early in the year, before we even knew what these 3 teams were going to look like exactly. Like, we had an idea, obviously, they were good football teams, but you and I said early in the year on previous podcasts that starting your season off like 6-2 was essential for this team, because it gets so hard down the stretch. Thankfully, the Steelers have a really, really good chance to make the playoffs. Like, things would have to be disaster. I think for them to miss the playoffs at this point, Shayne, they probably have to lose all 5 of their last games here, and a team would have to basically go undefeated at this point, either the Dolphins or the Colts, one of those teams, to kind of flip them positions. The Steelers need to get a game. They've got to get a game to at least secure their spot here. I think they're going to get a game or so, but this stretch is really, really tough. So, and Shayne, this is going to be wild. Somebody's going to take this out of context, but I want to give a disclaimer before I even say this. But knowing that the goal is a Super Bowl and not to do what the Steelers have done for the last X years. I mean, it's truly been 21 straight years of the non-losing record season. Obviously, some of those years were Super Bowl years, but I think 13 years now since they've had like meaningful postseason runs, and going on 8 years without a playoff win. Knowing that this has been their stretch. Again, it's going to be a wild take, so I just want you to brace yourself here. Should the Steelers kind of treat this road game against the Eagles like a bye week? And what I mean by that is, not to say right away, but if things go south really quickly, I'm pulling TJ Watt, I'm pulling Cam Hayward. I knowing that Pickens isn't playing in this game, if you get down 14, 17 points in this game early, I don't know what kind of chance you have anyway, because you're already the underdog in this game. But you can't afford an injury in mid-December that's going to set you back into the playoffs. And we've already got one that we're dealing with right now. Would you treat it that way, Shayne, or am I being completely off the wall here?
I think maybe more specifically, if it's the fourth quarter and the score is not manageable, right, where you can't realistically expect your team to come back from it, right? Mm-hmm. I do think you should start to see guys not play on defense, especially. Like, offensively, you're probably letting Russell play it out. Maybe you throw Fields in there, although they are getting close to like being able to guarantee he won't play 50% of the snaps, which would be great for draft capital going back to the Bears. But outside of that, like, I think the offense, those guys will play. But defensively, if you can get Cam Hayward out of there in the fourth quarter when it's not going well, if you can get TJ Watt going and get out of there, even Alex Highsmith, you probably do it. I don't know if this team will do that. Honestly, I don't think they would. I think unless it's like ridiculously out of reach that you'll probably see everybody play like they normally would. But yeah, I do understand where you're coming from though, because it's vastly important that this game does not go from bad as a loss to worse as also you lose somebody important for the last 3 games of the year. So I do get where you're coming from though.
Yeah, well, thankfully, it's not like last year. Last year, they had the really early bye week, and then you have to go the rest of the season without a break. This year, they at least had a week 9 bye, which means they're playing 9 straight games to get into the playoffs. But this isn't about playoffs. You're trying to get a Super Bowl as well. So not only do you talk about these regular season games, you add a game every time to get to the Super Bowl. So you're going to be playing 12 games if you want to get to the Super Bowl without a week break in between. You're not getting the first seed. I think it's I can't say that. You're very unlikely to get the first seed at this point. The Steelers would have to win out. They'd have to swing the game, which obviously would include the win over Kansas City, and they would have to hope that Kansas City and Buffalo lose still. Like they need those teams to lose still, which is possible. Buffalo plays the Lions here, and so that's obviously a game that they could lose. They're not going to lose games after that. I don't think. They play twice against New England, once against the Jets. But it's not just Buffalo. They need Kansas City to lose when Kansas City's got a much easier schedule remaining than Pittsburgh. So I think it's very, very unlikely. And stinking NFL, you don't get the second bye anymore. There's only 1 bye per conference. It's likely going to the Chiefs at this point, maybe the Bills, because of the strength of schedule. The Steelers would have to be flawless, and even then they don't control their own destiny at getting that bye. And so knowing that, Shayne, it's like if you get to the Super Bowl, that means you are playing 12 straight weeks without getting a break in between. It's still a really, really tough task when you can't get that bye anymore. So just a difficult situation all around. All right. Anything else you want to, you're breaking up on me a little bit here, Shayne, but we're going to keep going on and see if you pop back in here. You're getting a little bit fuzzy. All right. So Eagles, at Ravens, at Chiefs, a brutal gauntlet down the stretch here. Let's start with the first game. We're going to go through the Steelers versus Eagles week 15 preview and give our predictions for this. So let's talk about the Steelers versus Eagles odds here. In week 15, the Steelers opened the week as 4.5-point underdogs in this contest. That line has since shifted the opposite direction a little bit. 5-point underdogs according to DraftKings and 5.5-point underdogs according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And so the Steelers are kind of drifting the opposite direction that we want them to here. That could have had something to do with the Pickens news. Obviously, we hear that coming, that he's doubtful, and that line shifts a little bit that way. Not surprising to see at all, Shayne. And you would think, just on paper, Steelers are 10-3, Eagles are 11-2. Maybe this is more of a coin flip. Well, history would beg to differ that Steelers have not had good luck here. In knowing that their top skill player is very likely out for this contest, it's not hard to see why the line is set at where it is right now.
Yeah, and first of all, am I good on your end? Because you mentioned
you're good now. You're good.
Okay, cool. So in general, I do understand this line because you look at the way the Eagles have been playing. Now they are coming off of a so-so performance against the Panthers, who admittedly have been giving everybody games recently. Bryce Young is playing much more like a real NFL quarterback. That defense is not good, but it's playing tough. The run game has been there for them, like the offensive line's good. So they're not an easy out by any means. So I don't want to discredit anything the Panthers doing. But this Eagles team, for the most part, is running on all cylinders right now. They are just off to the races, especially Saquon Barkley, who is the number one concern for any team that they play the rest of the season. He's the key, because I think one way you can beat this Eagles team, and one way the Steelers specifically can beat this Eagles team, is if you can contain Saquon Barkley and you can contain Jalen Hurts as a runner. Their pass game has been questionable, to say the least, this season. And a lot of it, to me, has to do with, I think Jalen Hurts just has not really taken the next step as a passer the way that he was doing year over year for the beginning of his career. I think he has stalled as a passer. And also the chemistry is a little bit weird. There's been reports recently of A.J. Brown maybe not, and him not being very close anymore, and the receivers being upset with the way the offense is going and all this stuff. And I get it. You know, you're winning, so it's hard to complain. But when you're two of the higher paid receivers in the league, you expect to get the football. They're really not that much. Like it's a weird situation. So I do think that this line is fair, But I do see a route to, even without Pickens, I do think there is a path to victory here, but we'll talk about that more in a little bit.
Yeah, there's been some turmoil for sure when it comes to a little bit of strife on that relationship there. And if you look at Jalen Hurts over these last 3 games now, 179 yards against the Rams a few weeks ago, 118 passing yards against Baltimore, and 108 this past week. It barely eclipsed 100 yards against the Carolina Panthers in this game. And so there is some cause for concern if you're an Eagles fan in this game. That's why can't we get the passing game going? We're lacking the aggressiveness here. You can understand the frustrations from A.J. Brown, but it is interesting to note for sure. I do think the line is pretty fair overall, considering the circumstances both teams are dealing with. Injuries in this game, Shayne, obviously the biggest one to note is George Pickens. Not a lot of others as we do this, obviously, before the official injury report comes out. Is there any other players that you want to highlight here?
Not in particular. I mean, I think both these teams are kind of as healthy as they're going to get for right now. And I think that does give us a good idea of like how we stack up against some of the NFC's best, which is going to be important for kind of, even without Pickens, it's still going to be nice to know like kind of how we stack up against these guys. At the end of the day, with Pickens, with his injury, it just comes down to how you manufacture offense. You have to keep the ball. You have to be able to control the clock, because that's what the Eagles want to do, right? They want to run the football. There's a reason why, part of it is that Hurts has just not been as good as a passer this year. But the other part of it is they just want to run the football because they have Saquon Barkley and they have Jalen Hurts as runner. Like, they want to do that. And if you can do that yourself and then also get a couple of big plays in the passing game, that's how you can kind of limit them and try to give yourself a chance in this game.
Yeah, and that's something to watch. Obviously, let's talk about those matchups to watch. You mentioned Saquon, so let's start with him.
Yeah.
There's a few running backs in the NFL that are a tier above the rest. And I think that it's Saquon and Derrick Henry. You could have argued McCaffrey when he was healthy last year, obviously barely touched the football this year.
Yeah, not so much.
Can't stay healthy.
Yeah.
But there are a few that really matter. Saquon is one of them. He is such an elite football player. Now, in the first time of his career, you're seeing him with an actual good football team and what he can do for them. This is a scary matchup because he just needs a crease. He will take care of the rest. Steelers linebackers got to be filling holes. Elena Roberts, Patrick Queen coming downhill. That defensive line, this banged up defensive line, is going to have to hold up and be stout against the run in an offensive line that can bully you at times. And so you look at that matchup there, it is tough. And it's a one that I fear a lot. I think this is the biggest overall, the most threatening overall matchup for the Steelers is trying to contain Saquon Barkley. I think if you do that, you give yourself a good chance to win. Barkley's running all over you like he's done to so many teams this year. Your chances go down the drain.
Yeah, and that, again, like, they have to make sure that they do not have poor angles too in run pursuit, because he will break those angles. Like, that's one of the scariest things about Barkley. And you talked about, like, when he has a crease, he gets through it and then he accelerates through it. Like, it's not just like, oh, he can get a 20-yard burst here and there. He's going to break a tackle and kind of drag guys downfield. Like, he's going to run away from you really, like, consistently. He's one of the few backs in the league that can do that on a consistent basis. So, and we've seen that more this year than we ever have from him because he's had those holes to run through, right? And so if you're the safeties, especially Elliott and, like, obviously Fitzpatrick, you cannot afford to have poor tackling angles. He will run away from you. Those guys are good athletes, but they're not the same athlete that Barkley is. So that's going to be really important for them. Like you said, the linebackers have to make sure they're correct as often as possible with their keys, what they're looking at run defense, because, again, if you're wrong against the Eagles in the run game, it's a 50-yard play. Like, that's just kind of the reality of the situation with them, is that's how they are so explosive and how they beat you, is when they make you wrong in the run game, they make you pay for being wrong in the run game. It's not as simple as, oh, I know we gave up a first down and we'll just try again. It's like, no, but Barkley's run away from everyone on the defense when you're wrong. It's scary. It is.
He's so good, like on a per touch basis too, that you're really going to have to contain him. Dan, the Steelers fan, chimes in here with Goddard on IR. Yeah, Goddard was placed on IR on Saturday, so that will help some.
It will,
sure.
But,
it'll take some of the pressure off of these linebackers. I still think the key, regardless of whether or not Goddard would have been playing in this game, is stopping Saquon. I think if you can do that, you're going to limit the potential upside of the Eagles here. The question, though, I look at the receiver, though, knowing that AJ Brown is disgruntled right now. Are they going to make an added effort to get him the ball? They're probably not oblivious of this matchup that they've got coming up here with Joey Porter playing and the penalties that he's had this year.
Yeah.
Among all NFL leaders in that department, had 6 penalties 2 weeks ago against the Bengals and had a heck of a time trying to cover T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. And so maybe they'll look to exploit that matchup a little bit down the field there. Hopefully Porter can get a bounce back game. Kind of did that a little bit against Cleveland. The Browns didn't really get much going with the passing game. So keep an eye on that one as well. I think this goes without saying, but another matchup that you can absolutely look to, and one that we've been interested to see in the past because these teams are uncommon opponents. They don't play each other all the time. It's either once every 4 years because that's how the schedule lines up, or it goes record based on your previous season. And so just been a few of these matchups ever, but Lane Johnson trying to contain TJ Watt trying to kind of bounce back and get some rhythm going here against one of the best right tackles in the business. How do you see that matchup going this week?
Unfortunately, no one really beats Lane Johnson. It's kind of a known thing that he's probably, if we're just talking about pure like pass protection, I don't think it gets better in the league at either side than Lane Johnson. It's truly remarkable. Like if you were to look up his overall like pressure numbers allowed, sacks allowed, like just general like of being able to keep the quarterback from being touched, it really doesn't get better than him at the end of the day. So I'm not expecting anything crazy from TJ. It'd be nice for him to have a big game against Lane Johnson. It's asking a lot for him to do so. It's really going to be, for me, what can Highsmith do on the opposite side against an also incredible tackle in Jordan Mailata? This entire defensive front versus this entire offensive line is really the story of the game, in my opinion, because if one side demonstrably wins, they win the game, in my opinion. Like, I think one of them, I don't think either of them will win like outright. I think it's going to be a lot of back and forth, but if one side does dominate the other, that's probably the outcome of the game.
Yeah, and looking at that Watt versus Johnson matchup, I was able to sit down with Watt last year, and he told me that Lane Johnson was the best tackle he's ever played against. And it's kind of it's not a common tackle. Like he didn't pick somebody from the AFC North or from the AFC in general, but that's how good Lane Johnson is. It's not hard to see. I mean, that guy should be like Hall of Fame bound. He's really, really good.
Oh, yeah. So, he should be first ballot, in my opinion. But
yeah, for sure. So this is going to be another just difficult assignment for Watt. And it's not that Watt has played just absurdly good offensive tackles at times. It's the chip rate. It's everything else that goes into it. When Watt's been chipped 146 times this year, the highest clip in the league by a mile right now. And this is PFF's updated stat, just came out yesterday entering week 15. It is really hard to get a good rush going when you're chipped that often. When the chip disrupts your speed to power, your ability to convert speed to power, it disrupts your timing of the snap. And so you're just not able to get much from those snaps. And so you can see why some of those numbers have fallen a little bit. What will be interesting to see, Shayne, is if they decide to leave Johnson on an island with Watt, something that Johnson's able to do with most guys in this league, or if the more of the same will continue and Watt will be one of the most frequently chipped players again this week. So we'll find out.
Yeah, I do think that they're going to let Johnson take him one-on-one most of the time. I do. That's one of the reasons why they have him on the team and why he's been so good as they can do that. Right now, if it doesn't work or anything, they'll adjust. But I think they want to have other guys freed up to do different things and let Johnson take Watt on his own. So,
and they have a lot of confidence in Johnson, and they should. The problem is, if Johnson wins every rep but one against TJ Watt in this game, and that rep results in a strip sack and the Steelers flip the field the other way, that could be the difference of a game potentially. And so that's always a risk you run with a guy like TJ Watt. But Johnson, the matchups don't get any harder than that for the Steelers. Jordan Mailata on the other side, just as challenging basically in respect to who he's going up against. But I do think that the Steelers are going to have to win on the opposite side of Watt this week. I don't think that we can expect Watt to have a big game against an all-pro offensive tackle who is still playing at a peak performance. So if they can get something going against Mailata, maybe the combination of Nick Herbig and Highsmith can combine for a few big plays in this game. That's a big one there as well. Any other matchups that you want to highlight in this game, Shayne?
Honestly, I think also to a certain degree, it's Jalen Hurts as a runner versus this defense, because we've been fantastic at limiting quarterback rushing yards this season, but he is a little bit different than a lot of the quarterbacks we face. Lamar, as great of a runner as he is much more of a pocket passer nowadays. He isn't looking to scramble as much. The design run game is something they kind of go to and take away and go to. Like, it's not a consistent thing anymore with them. Hurts, he wants to run the football. They want him to run the football. Like, that is a concerted effort to do that. So how we defend against a team that's actively looking to run their quarterback is going to be interesting. We have the linebackers to run and chase and get him. We have, good tacklers there. So I expect it to do pretty well. But if they're able to consistently go to him as a runner, it's going to make that much harder to do anything else well against him.
Yeah, and the Eagles are as good at any team in the league as at imposing their will on the opposing defenses with the running game. And so, we're going to get into these situations at least a couple of times, Shayne, where they pull out the tush push play here. You get to you finally stop the Eagles and get them to like 4th and 1, 4th and inches, 4th and 2. Doesn't matter. They'll pull it out and they'll get that first down. And so just an impossible play to stop. So hopefully the Steelers can get these get Philly in 3rd and long situations often in this game. That would be the best case scenario here. That brings us to our game predictions for week 15 for the Steelers playing the Eagles in Philadelphia. Shayne, they've not had success there. Does that change this time around? We'll go ahead and start with you. Give us your predictions.
Unfortunately, I do not have much confidence that will change this time around, especially with Pickens being out. But even with him in, this is a tough matchup. It's against an NFC team that is playing about as well as anybody. The Panthers, like I said, the Panthers game, you can view that however you want. Panthers are tougher out than anyone's giving them credit for, so I don't blame them that much for that one. I have them winning 27-17. I don't think that the Steelers offense is going to be able to do a whole lot in this game, considering Pickens being out, and the Eagles defense has been very good. They'll get some stuff going. That they'll figure some stuff out. Wilson will have a couple balls that goes his way, but it's going to be tough sledding against a defense like this and an offense that can impose their will on the ground like they can.
Yeah, this is not a good matchup for the Steelers. I think that any way you look at it, this Eagles team is really talented from top to bottom. They haven't had success against a similar team. They just played each other 2 years ago. Obviously, the Steelers were much worse back then with Kenny Pickett and no offense.
A little worse.
But the Eagles team is more or less the same. And the holes they did have last year, they filled them. I think they got 2 spectacular rookies in the secondary in Cooper DeJean, Quinion Mitchell. This team is just as well-rounded as they come outside of maybe like the Lions right now in the NFL. It's just a really good roster from top to bottom.
Right.
I have the Steelers losing a 26-18 contest in this game. I think it's going to be just tough sledding all around for this team, whether it's getting the running game going, finding guys that you can rely on in the passing game, which they didn't do against the Browns. So it's hard to expect more success against the Eagles. But we will see. Anything's possible. Jalen Hurts has only been passing for less than 180 yards per game over these last 3 contests. And so maybe the Steelers will be able to hold them down and score enough points to come away victorious, snap that streak of not having a win in Philadelphia since 1965. We hope that ends this week, obviously. And if it does, the Steelers are sitting pretty. Maybe these final games don't mean quite as much. Maybe they can afford to drop either the Ravens or the Chiefs game. But this is big because you lose this one, and if the Ravens win, they're one game closer to you. That game next Saturday then would mean everything basically in terms of the division. So keep an eye out for what's happening around the rest of the league this time of year as well. It's very important. All right. We go live on this show every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. Also, be sure to check out Josh Yoris' show live on post game. So wherever the Steelers are playing, he's going to jump on immediately after the game. So make sure you jump on the Steel Curtain podcast to follow along with his post game recap. Thank you for joining us on the show today. You can follow Shayne on X at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on X at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain Steelers podcast. And thanks again for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.